The Opium Wars left China scarred in many ways, but one of the darkest legacies of this period is often overlooked: the rise of debt servitude, a system that trapped millions of Chinese citizens. The flood of opium, introduced by British merchants, didn't just cripple the economy. It tore apart families, destroyed communities, and enslaved future generations. This wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of a new kind of servitude. But how did this happen? How did so many Chinese citizens find themselves caught in a cycle of addiction and debt, leading to forced servitude? And what happened to those who were shipped off as laborers, never to see their homeland again? By the time the Opium Wars erupted in 1839, opium had already taken root in every corner of Chinese society. Once hailed for its medicinal properties, it had become a deadly addiction. In cities like Canton, the opium dens were a world apart, a place where hope faded as quickly as the smoke from the pipes. The air was thick with a sweet, suffocating scent, mingling with the sweat of the bodies packed into the dim, shadowy rooms. The flickering lamplight cast distorted figures on the walls as men sat hunched over, their hollow eyes lost in a daze. The low murmur of voices was interrupted only by the occasional hacking cough of an addict whose lungs had long since withered under the drug's poisonous grip. Can you picture it? Streets once bustling with trade and vitality, now silent but for the sound of shuffling feet. Families, who once worked their land with pride, now sold everything they had: cattle, land, even their children, to feed their cravings. Addiction knew no boundaries. It devoured the wealthy, the poor, the young, and the old. This wasn't just an accident of history. It was deliberate. British merchants flooded China with opium, knowing that addiction would pave the way for profit. The British East India Company, which controlled the opium trade, sold the drug on credit, trapping people in an endless cycle of debt. As historian Jonathan Spence puts it, opium became an economic weapon, a means to control not just China's markets, but its people. But the true tragedy came with the debt. Merchants extended credit at ruinous interest rates, knowing that the addicts couldn't repay. What happens when the debt comes due? When these debts mounted, the consequences were brutal. Merchants seized land and property from families that had already lost everything. Entire villages fell into ruin as men were forced to sell their labor, or worse, their family members. Imagine the heartbreak of a father who, in his desperation, sells his daughter into servitude to keep his family alive. How could this happen to an entire nation? In the countryside, local officials and landlords took advantage of the chaos, buying up land from starving peasants. Those who once owned small farms now found themselves laborious on the very soil that used to be theirs. Li Zhong, a former landowner from the southern province of Guangdong, had sold everything he owned to support his wife and 2 children during the worst of the opium crisis. He recalled, "I watched my wife grow thinner every day, my children begging for food. I had nothing left to sell but myself." When his family finally collapsed under the weight of debt, they were sent away as laborers, forever stripped of the life they once knew. And then came the coolie trade. Foreign recruiters swept through the villages, promising salvation, a fresh start abroad, good wages, and a way to escape the crushing burden of debt. But these recruiters weren't saviors, they were traffickers. Contracts were written in foreign languages, and most who signed them had no idea they were effectively signing their lives away. Once aboard the ships, the reality set in. Imagine the hold of a coolie ship. The stench of urine, sweat, and sickness filled the air. Men and women were shackled, packed so tightly that they could barely move. The sound of waves crashing against the ship's hull was drowned out by the cries of the sick and the dying. Chen Xian, a survivor of the coolie trade, recalled, "We were packed in like animals. The air was thick with rot, and each breath burned my lungs. The dead were thrown overboard to make room for the living." The nightmare continued when they reached their destinations. Coolies, primarily sent to British colonies, the Caribbean, South America, and Southeast Asia, faced grueling labor conditions. In Peru's guano mines, the air was acrid with the stench of bird and bat droppings. Men dug for hours under the scorching sun, their backs bent, their skin blistered and cracked. One Peruvian official described the guano mines as death pits, where coolies were worked until they had nothing left to give. The lucky ones survived. The unlucky ones perished, buried in unmarked graves, their names lost to history. But what of the next generation? What became of the children of the coolies, born in foreign lands far from the soil their parents once called home. In Cuba, where Chinese coolies replaced African slaves on the sugar plantations after abolition, the second and third generations of Chinese laborers faced a harsh reality. Their futures were as bleak as their parents'. One descendant, Huan Li, recalled his grandfather's suffering. He worked from sunup to sundown, with barely enough food to survive. He told me that his only dream was to return to China, but he never did. Generations later, these scars remain. In Southeast Asia, the descendants of coolies worked on rubber plantations. They faced systemic discrimination, locked in the same cycle of poverty and marginalization that had trapped their parents. In some regions, these descendants still live at the bottom of the social hierarchy, defined by the labor and suffering of their ancestors. The Opium Wars didn't just destroy China's economy or tear apart its social fabric. They shattered lives across the world, creating a system of exploitation that spanned generations. The cycle of debt and servitude that began in the 19th century didn't end with the wars. It stretched across oceans, binding future generations to the suffering of their ancestors. So, what can we learn from this? The human cost of the Opium Wars is more than just a number in history books. It's the story of families torn apart, lives lost, and futures stolen. The coolies, and the generations that followed, serve as a reminder that the scars of history never truly fade. Stay curious, seek wisdom, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.